And French President Emmanuel Macron saying its ambassador to Niger will stay in Niamey, that's the capital, despite pressure to leave. He was given a 48-hour deadline to leave the country last Friday for allegedly refusing to meet with the coup leaders. Now, Niger's ousted President Mohamed Bazoum has been detained along with his family at the presidential palace. Macron reiterating that his country's support for Bazoum, saying that the leader's decision not to resign is courageous. All right, let's get some analysis around this now, and we speak to Joseph Ochieno, who is a writer and commentator on African Affairs. Mr. Ochieno, thank you very much for your time. Your analysis of the situation that is developing in Niger, how worse are things going to get between this relationship between the new leaders in Niger and France?
That's a very important question, but I think it's not about the situation, or if you like, the relationship between the new regime and France. But I think actually the position France has taken, notwithstanding everything else about coups and unacceptability of coups on the African continent, is a hypocrisy. If African nations talk sovereignty, and if African continents, only recently African leaders were saying that they cannot be instructed, if you like, they cannot be instructed or imposed upon by other global powers, in this particular case, particularly Western leaders. You know, what is it the case? What is it then that a French president decides that his ambassador is not going to leave a sovereign country called Niger? You know, I think the more this mix takes place, the more it becomes very apparent that there is something completely inherently wrong with African systems and institutions, and there is something absolutely wrong about global polity and hypocrisy and contradictions around, if you like, international law and rules. You know, France can go into Niger, Nigeria, or perhaps even powerful South Africa cannot go and play this game on any tiny little African country, even if it was Lesotho, and the rest of the world would keep quiet. So no, while it's absolutely true that coups are not desirable, I have campaigned against the military dictatorship, including my own native one in Uganda, for the last 30 or so years. I completely believe also that, on the other hand, there have been coups in recent times on the African continent, and many of these powers have not responded. So France is taking this position because its interests are under threat. France is taking its position because of Western Europe. But beyond that, it's really neither here nor there.
All right. So it's a very interesting angle that you've chosen to explore here and focus on. So what is it, what's in it for France then to refuse for its ambassador to leave? Because if its ambassador is going to stay on, that assumes that the military officers that are there who are from France or are of French origin, they're also going to stay put. And so what's in it for France to stay on in Niger? And that interesting dynamic, though, because remember, Niger has the support of Mali and Burkina Faso. Now, on the part of Mali, we have heard recently that there is this involvement of the Wagner group. And is there an interesting dynamic there developing given the death of the Wagner group leader?
Possibly less about the death of the Wagner group leader, but really the fact and reality that Wagner is there, but also that this is an advanced, now much more practical Cold War, you know, in practice. It's very, very clearly, in part, that's the case. But of course, you know, for this program, maybe you could go on and on. I wanted to bring that towards the end. It's very much the case that in France's case, the uranium for which is dependent is at stake. The gold about which is dependent is at stake. And remember, only France is speaking on behalf of Western powers, simply because these are former French colonies. Western, you know, nations, you know, global North particularly, they're very smart in how to operate. I'm sure these decisions is taking place, but you know, conversations are taking place, I'm sure, between London, Washington, Paris, and perhaps even Bonn. You know, but whatever the case, it's very much about their interest. This tiny little contradiction there is this. If there is threat of armed strike, or if you like, invasion, will they invade with the French ambassador in Niamey? Will they invade with the French troops down there? Are they willing, as you rightly suggest, that Chad is involved? Chad is a party, Mali is a party, Burkina Faso is a party, and these guys speak seemingly in a manner in which they also need to be taken rather seriously, considering the fragility of the situation there. But no, I'm saying again that on the basis of what France has said, what does international law say? What is the question of sovereignty say? What is the African Union simply going to say? Simply because one little bad boy, in this case Niger, has misbehaved, does it mean therefore that our compound can be invaded at will? You know, these guys made noises about Libya. What is their position on this? You know, the underlying thing that came up, and I've told other programs, I'm not sure whether I told you, is that for the first time for me since Thomas Sankara, I am giving a possibility of giving an ear to a military regime that has come in simply to say that, look, you know, whatever is happening in our country is not sustainable. And these coup leaders have raised the very important question. What happens when in South Africa or in Uganda or wherever else people are talking about state capture? What happens when people are talking about corruption, involving billions of US dollars? What happens when, opposition leaders are missing, in this case, across the continent, whether it's in Kenya, Uganda, or perhaps in some cheeky place in Congo? What happens, when citizens are being brutalized across the continent? What happens when elections are massive and openly rigged by these new democracies in town? Where is the African Union? Where are the regional blocs? Where are the powerful African leaders, who should actually be, whipping off their brothers, telling them that, no, don't go down there. So then, if really everything else can happen in this continent, meaning African citizens can be massacred, at will, when neighboring countries are saying, or other countries are saying, oh, that's okay, that's sovereignty. But then, when military guys come in, we say, no, that's unacceptable. Then I am beginning to review my position on some of these things. Just give it a thought.
Interesting point indeed. And let's conclude the conversation on this quick one. So, the current democracies that we have at the moment, are you in any way suggesting that these are old boys clubs that have, in some instances, no care for the well-being of citizens? And I speak in mind with what has just occurred next door to South Africa. There's a disputed election there, and in particular, SADC seems to be raising its voice, saying what has happened here, there are many faults, and perhaps this could taint the image of the recent election. What are your thoughts around that?
I am generally a shy observer, but in part this is some of the conversation I'm trying to refer to, quite absolutely correctly. It's not only an old boys club. It's actually a terrible club, I want to say this. And, some of these leaders are my friends, and some of these leaders are people whom I respect. You call it democracy. Talk 54 African nation states, and I just give you homework with your producers and your investigators down there. Count out of the African continent where you can actually put 20 nation states, which you can say a relative stable democracy, where the respect is rule of law, where the respect institutional systems, where governments change hands without any particular problems, where perhaps even inter within a political party that you talk transition, where a leader is able to hand over to another. Look at our one in Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, who subjected this nation state to terror, and took over power, claiming democracy. 40 years on, the guy's on, and is turning it in a monarchy. You guys are lucky you've got Zulu Kingdom, but Zulu Kingdom does not claim Pretoria or in this case, Cape Town. Yeah. No, this is exactly what I'm talking about. It's actually unfortunate that very recently, as we're concluding the powerful BRICS summit in South Africa, which, we're delighted that you guys were hosting it, I suggest that these are some of the original big thinking of these nation states, and thanks to the likes of President Mbeki, who were the then big thinkers. How are we going to turn around our continent? How are we going to turn around, if you like, the minor alternative to the G7 of that time? These are the conversations we need to be having, and you're absolutely right. What happens, with the exception recently in Zambia, see what happens here in our own neighborhood in Kenya. It's extraordinary what's happening in this continent. This boys' club, whatever happens in Niger, I hope the conversation begins. But this conversation is not going to be around the leaders. This conversation is going to be pushed by you, the media. This conversation should really be pushed by the academics and academics, but particularly and intellectuals, because there seem to be an intellectual class that are quite comfortable on the continent, perfecting the art of eating the little bit of crumbs they can get from these guys. No, this conversation must be driven by the African youth, in particular in institutions and schools and colleges, and it's a conversation that I am delighted to be part of at the moment.
Joseph Ochieno, thank you very much, a writer and commentator on African affairs. All right.